Most people look at a racing car and see speed. They see the glamour of the podium and the roar of the crowd.
But at Motor Tales, we look beneath the surface. We see the pressure of a boardroom in Stuttgart,
The fatal ambition of an engineer, and the haunting memory of a machine that became a weapon. In June 1955, the world watched as a silver arrow flew into a crowd, changing the course of history forever. It wasn't just a disaster, it was a consequence of decisions made long before the green flag dropped. Every machine carries a memory, and some lessons are learned too late. This is Le Mans 1955. The mid-1950s were not simply a period of reconstruction for Germany. They were a time defined by urgency, restraint, and an unspoken need for redemption through competence. The country did not seek sympathy, nor did it attempt to rebuild its reputation through emotion or narrative. What remained acceptable, both internally and abroad, was engineering, precision, results that could not be argued with. In this environment, Mercedes-Benz did not return to racing as a spectacle, but as a statement. The Silver Arrows were conceived not as nostalgic symbols of pre-war glory, but as proof that German technical mastery still existed, intact and disciplined. Every decision inside the company carried weight far beyond performance metrics. Racing was not entertainment, it was validation. As the engineers in Stuttgart refined the 300 SLR, they were not simply designing a car, they were constructing an argument, one measured in lap times and mechanical superiority. By the time the team arrived at Le Mans in June of 1955, the pressure was no longer internal, it was global. The world would watch, not for drama, but for confirmation. Mercedes had come not to compete, but to demonstrate that their understanding of machines, systems, and control remained unmatched. The 300 SLR represented the extreme end of that philosophy. It was not built to be forgiving, nor adaptable, nor cautious. It was built to be correct, according to a narrow definition of efficiency. Its bodywork was formed from electron, a magnesium-aluminum alloy chosen for one reason alone: weight reduction. The material was known to be highly flammable, but in the hierarchy of priorities, this risk was considered acceptable. Speed was tangible, fire was hypothetical. Under the hood sat a straight-eight engine derived from aircraft technology, a reminder that the boundary between racing and warfare had not yet fully dissolved. While competitors like Jaguar had begun adopting disc brakes, Mercedes remained committed to large drum systems, trusting their understanding of airflow and mechanical balance to compensate. The solution was the now famous air brake, deployed behind the driver to stabilize the car under deceleration. It was an elegant answer to a problem created by ambition itself. Each innovation solved a specific issue, but none addressed the larger question forming quietly beneath the surface: whether the system as a whole had outpaced the environment in which it was being deployed. At the center of this mechanical logic stood the drivers, tasked with translating theory into motion. Juan Manuel Fangio represented the ideal outcome of that system. Calculated, disciplined, and emotionally detached, he understood how to operate at the edge without crossing it. Alongside him was Pierre Levey, a man whose presence in the Mercedes lineup carried a different meaning. At 50 years old, Levey was not a rising star, nor a symbol of the future. He was a reminder of endurance, of persistence earned through experience rather than raw speed. 3 years earlier, he had nearly won Le Mans alone, driving for over 23 hours without relief before mechanical failure ended his effort. That performance had earned him respect, but also placed him at the margins of a sport that was evolving rapidly. In 1955, Levay was entrusted with one of the most advanced racing machines ever built. The tension was subtle, invisible to spectators. A driver formed in one era was now operating a machine designed for another. No one openly questioned whether the human reflexes at the center of the system were still aligned with the machine's capabilities. The assumption remained that discipline and experience would be enough. Race day unfolded under conditions that reinforced confidence rather than caution. The weather was clear, the crowd was vast. The circuit, though narrow and improvised by modern standards, had hosted endurance racing for decades without fundamental reconsideration. Spectators stood close to the track, separated by little more than earthen embankments and habit. Within the opening laps, lap records fell. The pace escalated rapidly, and the narrative of a grand duel between Mercedes and Jaguar took shape. Germany versus Britain, engineering against engineering. To the public, it was a celebration of progress and prosperity. Inside the cockpits, it was something else entirely. Drivers navigated traffic at closing speeds that left no margin for hesitation. Braking zones overlapped with pit entry. Faster cars threaded past slower ones on asphalt never designed for such disparity. Yet nothing appeared out of control. The system had not failed before, and so it was assumed it would continue to function. Familiarity had dulled perception. Danger had become routine, and routine had been mistaken for safety. As the race approached the first major sequence of pit stops late in the afternoon, the accumulation of small decisions began to compress time and space. Mike Hawthorne, driving for Jaguar, was deeply engaged in a personal and national rivalry, pushing to assert dominance not only over his competitors, but over the narrative of the race itself. Fuel levels dropped, lap times tightened. The margin for error narrowed. In that final stretch of normalcy, engineers monitored stopwatches, spectators leaned forward over the embankments, and the machinery performed exactly as it had been designed to do. Nothing yet felt exceptional, and yet within that ordinary moment, the system had reached its limit. Pierre Levesque raised his hand, signaling to the driver behind him, an instinctive act of communication in a world moving too fast for words. The convergence was complete. The window in which human judgment could compensate for structural risk was closing. What followed would not be the result of a single mistake, but the inevitable outcome of a sequence that had been set in motion long before the cars arrived in France. Late in the afternoon, the race at Le Mans had settled into a rhythm that felt familiar to everyone involved. The opening frenzy had passed, strategies were unfolding, and the endurance nature of the event was beginning to assert itself. Drivers focused on consistency rather than outright aggression, while teams monitored fuel consumption, tire wear, and lap differentials with growing precision. To an outside observer, nothing suggested that this moment was any different from countless others that had preceded it in the history of the race. The circuit remained crowded, the pit lane active, and the pace relentlessly high. Yet beneath this apparent normality, conditions were quietly aligning in ways that left no margin for correction. The disparity of speed between different classes of cars had grown extreme. Braking zones overlapped with pit entries. Communication relied on hand signals and instinct rather than structured systems. Still, the race continued without interruption, sustained by the assumption that experience and vigilance were enough. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. The system appeared stable precisely because it had not yet failed.
As the clock approached 6:26 p.m., Mike Hawthorne found himself acting on instinct rather than calculation. Having just overtaken slower traffic and conscious of his fuel situation, he made the decision to enter the pits immediately. The maneuver itself was not unusual. What mattered was how it was executed and what followed. Hawthorne braked sharply, relying on the superior stopping power of Jaguar's disc brakes, a technological advantage that allowed him to decelerate far more aggressively than many of his competitors. Behind him, Lance Macklin, driving an Austin Healey, reacted instinctively, swerving to avoid a collision with the suddenly slowing Jaguar. This movement placed Macklin directly into the racing line of the Mercedes driven by Pierre Levesque, which was approaching at significantly higher speed. None of these actions were reckless in isolation. Each made sense within the context of the moment, but together they formed a chain that could not be broken. Mechanical advantage met human reaction time in a space too narrow to absorb the difference.
Pierre Levesque had no meaningful opportunity to avoid what followed. In the fraction of a second available to him, he raised his hand to warn Juan Manuel Fangio behind him, an instinctive act of communication that would later be recognized as one of the most consequential gestures in the history of the sport. The Mercedes struck the rear of Macklin's car, using it as an unintended ramp. What happened next was not chaos, but physics behaving exactly as it always does. The 300 SLR was launched into the air at enormous speed, its trajectory carrying it toward the packed spectator area. Upon impact with the embankment, the car disintegrated. Heavy components separated instantly, continuing forward with lethal momentum. The lightweight magnesium body ignited, producing intense heat that conventional fire suppression could not contain. There was no single moment of realization. The scale of what had occurred unfolded over seconds, then minutes, as smoke rose and the noise of the race continued uninterrupted. In the immediate aftermath, officials faced a decision that would define the moral core of the event. The race was not stopped. The justification was practical rather than ethical. Authorities feared that halting the event would trigger panic among the massive crowd, clogging access roads and preventing emergency vehicles from reaching the injured. From a logistical standpoint, the decision appeared defensible. From a human one, it was devastating. As rescue efforts unfolded behind the barriers, cars continued to pass the scene at full speed. The contrast was stark. Competition persisted alongside catastrophe, and the illusion that racing existed in a controlled, isolated environment collapsed entirely. The spectacle could no longer be separated from its consequences. In choosing continuity, the organizers revealed how deeply the priorities of the era were embedded. The race was not simply an event, it was a system that resisted interruption, even when interruption was morally unavoidable. Inside the Mercedes camp, information arrived slowly and incompletely. Engineers and mechanics struggled to understand the scale of what had occurred, piecing together reports amid confusion and disbelief. Fangio, now safe, became acutely aware that Levesque's final action had spared his life. As the hours passed, the weight of responsibility shifted from the circuit to Stuttgart. Late that night, after urgent discussions across borders, the order was given. Mercedes-Benz would withdraw from the race. The decision was not announced with fanfare or justification. It was executed quietly. One by one, the remaining silver arrows were called into the pits and removed from competition. The cars were pushed away under cover of darkness, their absence more powerful than any statement. The race would continue without them, but the era they represented had ended. The chain of seconds was complete. What remained was consequence.
At morning at Le Mans, it did not bring relief or clarity. The race had ended, the official results had been recorded, and a winner had been declared. Yet the significance of those outcomes felt strangely hollow. The circuit itself seemed altered, not by physical damage alone, but by the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. In the Mercedes pit area, where precision and repetition once defined every movement, there was only absence. The silver arrows were gone, withdrawn quietly during the night, leaving behind an emptiness that drew more attention than any victory celebration nearby. In Stuttgart, the leadership of Mercedes-Benz confronted the reality of what had unfolded. The brand had returned to racing to demonstrate discipline, control, and technical mastery in a post-war world that demanded proof rather than promises. Instead, the same machines now appeared across newspapers and broadcasts as symbols of devastation. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. What had been intended as validation became exposure. The realization settled slowly but decisively. The meaning attached to the silver arrows had changed, and no clarification or explanation could reverse it. The decision to withdraw was no longer tactical. It was existential. What followed was not a public apology or a carefully shaped narrative. It was silence, sustained and deliberate. Mercedes-Benz did not prepare for a quick return, nor did it seek to reclaim its position through incremental distance from the event. Instead, the company withdrew entirely from top-level motorsport, stepping away from endurance racing and Formula One alike. This absence would last decades. It was not framed as punishment, nor publicly defined as responsibility, yet it carried elements of both. Internally, the conclusion was clear. Some risks, once realized, could not be justified again. The cars themselves were removed from competition and placed into controlled preservation, no longer revolving, no longer tested at the limits they had exposed. Engineering work continued, but without the pressure of public dominance. By choosing not to return, Mercedes accepted a loss that extended beyond trophies or reputation. They relinquished relevance in a sport they had once shaped. The silence from Stuttgart became its own statement, communicating restraint without explanation. It suggested an understanding that presence alone carries responsibility, and that absence, in this case, was the only acceptable response. Beyond the boundaries of a single company, the effects of 1955 spread across the racing world. Public confidence faltered, and governments reacted with caution that bordered on prohibition. Switzerland banned circuit racing entirely, a decision that would stand for more than half a century and reflect the depth of public unease. Elsewhere, races continued, but not unchanged. Circuits were forced to confront their own inadequacies. Spectator areas were moved further from the track, barriers were reinforced, and the casual closeness between speed and crowds began to disappear. These changes were not welcomed unanimously. Teams resisted new regulations, citing cost, complexity, and tradition. Drivers accepted risk as part of their profession and often viewed safety interventions as interference. Yet the logic was unavoidable.
The machines had evolved beyond the environments designed to contain them and beyond the assumptions that human judgment alone could compensate for systemic flaws. Racing entered a transitional period where progress was no longer measured solely by speed, but by the ability to prevent its consequences from repeating themselves.
Within this broader transformation, Pierre Lévesque's role took on a quieter significance. Official histories would record him primarily as a participant in catastrophe, his name linked permanently to the accident itself. But within the sport, his final actions were understood differently. The raised hand that warned Fangio was not heroic in intention. It was instinctive, immediate, and human. Yet its impact reshaped outcomes beyond calculation. Fangio survived, and with him, an era-defining figure of the sport. In later reflections, Mercedes would acknowledge, without public emphasis, that the balance between driver and machine had been misjudged. Lévesque was not careless, nor was he unprepared. He was operating at the limits he had been asked to accept, inside a system that demanded more than those limits could sustain. His memory endured not as a symbol of failure, but as evidence of how responsibility ultimately rests on decisions made far from the cockpit. Machines retain memory, and Le Mans ensured that this one would not fade.
What ultimately remained from Le Mans 1955 was not confined to the circuit, nor preserved only in memory. It was written into policy, regulation, and institutional restraint. In the years that followed, the sport did not evolve through reflection alone, but through documentation. Rules were amended, standards were formalized, distances were measured, responsibilities were reassigned. These changes did not arrive dramatically, nor did they offer closure. They arrived quietly, embedded in procedures that would govern generations of racing without ever mentioning the names of those lost. Mercedes-Benz eventually returned to competition, but under a framework that no longer allowed brilliance to exist without accountability. The lesson of 1955 was not preserved as a story told aloud, but as a condition built into the system itself. The machine remembered, not through scars or silence, but through constraint. And that, more than any monument or memorial, became the true legacy of Le Mans.